The Augustinian Imperative is, as scholar William E. Connolly writes, the quest to move closer to one's truest self by exploring its inner geography. Jean Bethke Elshstein notes, Augustine stresses our capacity to love, and he dethrones not reason, but too narrow an understanding of rationalism. To say that Augustine holds a tremendous influence over Western culture would be an understatement. He is the most important individual in the history of Western Christianity, whose shadow also looms over much of Western philosophy, especially, surprising to many, modern philosophy, despite its secularized incarnation, which still wrestles with that quest to move closer to one's truest self. Despite Augustine's legacy, many people who know the name have never read him, and if he is remembered at all, it is as the inventor of the Christian doctrine of original sin. Beyond being simply factually inaccurate, this perception distorts what academia primarily addresses when dealing with Augustine's legacy. Not his theology of sin and salvation, but his theology and philosophy of the self, of consciousness, the will, memory, of authenticity. Augustine's most prominent contribution to Western culture is summed up by those two statements from William E. Connolly and Jean Bethke Elshstein. Augustine provides for us the first systematic attempt to understand the self, not, as the Greek philosophers would have it, by looking outward into the cosmos and to nature, but by looking inwardly to that inner geography of the human heart and soul. Many very ignorant and uneducated people, propagandists of the new science, like to say that Augustine placed faith over reason, never really defining what they mean by faith or reason. Such people have never read Augustine, for Augustine says in De Trinitate that the soul is the rational intellect, the rational part of the human mind. To possess reason is to be made in the image of God. As Jean Bethke Elshstein writes, Augustine stresses our capacity to love, and in doing so dethrones not reason, but too narrow an understanding of rationalism. For Augustine, coming to terms with the self means exploring the true organ of human existence, not the mind, but the heart, the true seat of what compels human action and influences human decision-making, what we love, not what we think. For Augustine, reason is the secondary essence of human nature. Love is the primary essence of human nature. Concerning Augustine's elaboration on original sin, he notes in his various writings, especially The City of God, that it was human reasoning that caused Adam and Eve to fall into the web of deception and lies. It wasn't their heart. To sin, according to Augustine, is to lie to oneself about the nature of reality in relationship to the nature and desire of love itself. We choose, therefore, to live by lies, as he says, and not by truth, which is love. Truth is love, as he famously declared, is one of his most enduring statements. What Augustine does, then, in the history of philosophy is marry philosophy with theology. Theology is concerned with persons and personality, selfhood and the self. God is, after all, a person. Philosophy, as Augustine also knew from his education, is concerned with the outer world of nature, phusos in Greek. In the Confessions, Augustine's pursuit of philosophy to understand himself, as he famously reflects, ended in failure. What Augustine came to realize was that his attempt to understand himself, who he was doomed to failure because philosophy was a hobbled intellectual enterprise from its own construction. With its concern just for the outer world of objects and things, philosophy had cut itself off from the inner world of the self, of the human heart, of self-consciousness. As Augustine laments, when he searched for God and sought to understand himself, he could not find God out there, and therefore couldn't find himself out in the vast space of the cosmos, as the Greek Stoics would have it. It was only by turning inward, Augustine realizes in his eureka moment, that he discovered God and himself. This inward turn to the self, the incurvatus in se in Latin, is what scholars concentrate on when assessing Augustine's immense legacy to Western intellectual culture. Augustine proceeds to provide an elaborate and systematic philosophical theology, marrying the philosophy of nature, objects and things, with the theology of personhood and personalism, self and subjectivity. Mihi quaestio factus sum, Augustine famously said, I have become a question even to myself. Thinking, not observation, becomes the key to self-understanding once you turn inward and begin looking at the human heart. Thus we can see how Augustine marries the inner and the outer, how he ties together the heart and the soul. Thinking is, of course, an internal enterprise once you understand it properly. In thinking about oneself, Augustine moves beyond the mere materialism of Epicureanism and Manichaeanism, which had dominated his early life. In thinking about oneself, Augustine probes the innermost geography of the human heart, the true essence of human nature. Our heart is restless until it finds rest in thee, as one of Augustine's most famous phrases in the Confessions announces. The words that Augustine uses most in his corpus of writing are cor and amor and caritas, heart and love, or charitable love. It's not surprising that these would be his most used words in Latin, given how he links the two together. To have a heart is to have the possibility to love. To love entails having a heart. To understand oneself, one must understand the nature of love, the nature of the human heart, and how the human heart influences the actions of our embodied existence. This is why Augustine is considered a philosopher and theologian of the will and not the intellect. He is a voluntarist, concerned with the nature of human action as it stems from human love, rather than an intellectualist who believes that human action derives from rational calculation. This is why Christianity, in comparison to the new science of modernity, seems radically introspective, and in the words of people like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Neil deGrasse Tyson, supposedly anti-science, whatever they mean by the phrase anti-science. Christian theology, following Augustine, is concerned with the inner world of the self, of subjectivity, of persons and personhood. Once you understand this, so much of our contemporary rhetoric and language usage begins to make sense. Augustinian theology deals with the self, the inner world of the human heart, and necessarily and therefore morality and ethics, how we should relate to others. Knowledge of love and human relationships, Augustine asserts, is the highest form of wisdom in life. It does one no good, Augustine continues to explain, to know all the secrets of the cosmos if one doesn't know how to love and to relate to other human beings. And how often we see this in our world today, that some of the most intelligent people who know the most about the outer world, the world of nature, are complete assholes to human beings. The new science of Francis Bacon, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, René Descartes, and the Enlightenment project dethrones this concern with the self in relation to other. Wisdom, according to the new science, is not knowledge of the self in relation to others. Wisdom is, as Bacon explained, knowledge of the operations of the material, physical world. This is what leads, of course, to the philosophy of utilitarian scientism. In our world today, we are living through the battle between what remains of the Augustinian imperative, that concern with the self, authenticity, and how to love and relate with others, versus the new science, the concern with the outer world, the operational laws of the universe, and what that knowledge implies for our existence. But the great contribution of Augustine, as the historian Christopher Dawson wrote, was that he placed the emphasis of human nature on the human heart and the seemingly incomprehensible personalities of the self that derive from the human heart. The Augustinian imperative, to go back to William E. Connolly, is that quest to move closer to one's truest self by exploring its inner geography. Augustine's philosophy and theology is ultimately the philosophy and the theology of the self, and not the world.